Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us at the 107th International Labour Conference in Geneva. My name is Rosalind Yard. Today we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of a landmark agreement between governments, workers and employers' representatives on core labour rights at work. It's called the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, and it commits member states to respect rights and principles in 4 major categories. And we'll talk a bit more about those categories a bit later. We'll be discussing the declaration and why it was and still is so important, what's been achieved in this last 20 years, and what's still to be achieved. With me is Beata Andres, Chief of the ILO's Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work branch, and also Carrie Tapiola, former Executive Director and Special Advisor to the ILO Director General, and also author of this book, which was launched today, on the Declaration. Carrie and Beata, welcome. Now, we want you to be part of the conversation, so please post your questions in the comments section, and I'll put them to the panellists. Firstly, Beata, can you give us an overview of the declaration? What is it exactly?
Well, first of all, a declaration is really an expression of political will. It's an instrument of soft law, of course. It's not binding. It can't be ratified as such. But what we are saying, it's an instrument that has teeth and has had really tremendous impact in the world of work on the principles enshrined in the Declaration: freedom of association, collective bargaining, the elimination of child labor, forced labor, and all forms of discrimination at work. So what the Declaration really does, and I think that was the major landmark achievement at the time in 1998, was that it obliges ratifying as well as non-ratifying member states to respect and promote and realize those principles, as well as the conventions that we have on those principles. And that was new at the time and is still quite remarkable today.
Right. And obviously there must have been a need at the time for this declaration. Carrie, perhaps you can give us a picture of what the world was like in 1998 when it was thought that there was this need to have this declaration.
Yes, well, we have to go a little bit further back. Actually, I cover about 30 years in this book because this debate started immediately after the Cold War ended and the world economy started being globalized. And what happened was when the division in the world ended, the walls came down, trade became more and more open, free in the whole world. People saw that behind those walls you had the same old problems. You had the problems of child labor, forced labor, denial of trade union rights, discrimination, and so on. So that led into a very deep and difficult discussion on what the conditions for fair trade are, actually. What are the social conditions and what are the consequences of trade, and how to make sure that trade can take place in a way that you don't use children or forced labor or discrimination, but that you fully respect fundamental labor rights.
Right. So we're going to go and try to kind of unpick some of that a little later. But firstly, as I said, you've today launched your book, and here it is. And it's got quite an intriguing title, which is the Teeth of the ILO. Why did you choose this title? Why the teeth of the ILO?
You see, I chose this title because I have been saying for about 22 years now that we always end up with this question of dental work. Does the ILO have teeth or not? Every single time over the last 22 years, when I have been participating in a discussion on how effective the ILO can be, the question then comes up, but you really don't have teeth, you don't have sanctions, you can only name and shame countries or so on, but you can't really be effective. And I have continuously said that, look, if we look at the measures that are available for the ILO, through technical cooperation, through the follow-up of both situations in countries that have ratified conventions and other countries. So we have actually much more teeth than most others have. And this is why this book is an attempt to answer the question, does the ILO have teeth or not? And I'm trying to show in it that it actually does, and they work.
Okay, and in fact we will talk about the kind of measures that are kind of implemented in implementing this declaration as well a bit later in this interview. But first of all, I mean, we don't have that much time, but can you give me just a kind of a short overview of the book, the kind of areas that it's looking at in just kind of 3 short sentences?
Well, it explains how a discussion on links between trade and labor standards turned into action in the ILO, because the ILO is the right place to deal with labor standards, and then it describes how working on the ground with countries which are ready to work with the ILO, so we can actually get results. We have results in terms of less child labor, abolishment of forced labor, democratization, which has led into workers' rights, trade union rights, and less discrimination.
Right, okay. And actually we've already got our first question, which is quite early in a Facebook Live, and it's from Marimba, and she's asking, can you give us examples of when the ILO has shown its teeth over the last 20 years? Hopefully there are lots of examples.
Perhaps let me start with the big picture and sort of the big teeth that we have shown. When you look at the numbers on child labor, you know, when the declaration was adopted in 1998, the number that was out there was 250 million children in child labor. 2 years later, we had confirmed this number with reliable statistics, more reliable, 246 million. Today we say 152 children in child labor. So it's a reduction by almost 100 million girls and boys less in child labor. And to a great extent, it's because ILO constituents, governments, workers, employers, collectively took action. So it's a remarkable achievement within, you know, historically speaking, relatively short period of time. And then we have, of course, many countries' examples, and I'll just give one, and I'm sure Carrie has more. But last week, the president of Colombia came to the ILO to address this audience, and he spoke about the peace process in Colombia, about social justice, and a major part of his speech was on freedom of association and collective bargaining, and how important it was, you know, to protect trade unionists from reprisals, and thank the ILO for the help. And I think really this is a testimony that speaks for itself. But I'm sure Carrie, who's been around much longer, has many others.
Yes, Colombia is one example of where this has worked. I would also say that take Myanmar, the whole question of forced labor in Myanmar. At this moment, there still are problems, but there's no denial. The problems have been recognized. You know, if 20 years ago, very many people said that, well, child labor, what can you do to that? You know, it's a cultural phenomenon and etc. Nobody says that anymore. Everybody agrees that it is an issue that something can be done to, and we have shown what can be done to that. I'll give a little example. If you want to see the change, in a ministry in one of the African countries, once they started working with the ILO on child labor, the office of the person who was in charge of child labor was way down the corridor, somewhere as far from the minister as possible. A couple of years later, that office was next to the minister's office. The issue had become a strategically important issue.
Yeah, so you're really kind of also talking about attitude change, and I guess attitude
Absolutely.
change comes before implementation. It's quite an important thing.
You see, there are two phases. Every time you have a problem, and this is particularly with core labor standards, because we are talking about human rights at work. The first question is there political will or not? And if there is, then you start finding out how you can work things so that this will can be translated into action. If there is no political will, you have to use other means. South Africa at the time of apartheid and so on. Myanmar was over the years a combination of capacity, looking at capacity of dealing with forced labor and the will to deal with forced labor. What we need is to work on the capacity and make it possible for governments and for people in general to change their attitudes to that it is not dangerous to actually have decent labor relations. It pays.
Right. Okay. So thank you, Marimba, for your question. And please, all of you who are watching this broadcast, please also send your questions as well, because I think this is a really kind of key topic that we're talking about. We'd really appreciate your participation. So, Carrie, let's go back, 20 years. And you played a key role in the adoption of this declaration. I mean, what's your most vivid memory of those 3 weeks of the conference when, during those negotiations 20 years ago?
Well, negotiations are negotiations, and I say somewhere in the book that these processes are partly, partly you have strategic aims which you work towards, and partly you do tactics, and then partly they're pure hazard. Things happen in negotiations. The negotiations got stuck in the last week at around midnight on Saturday, and in the end the workers walked out. My most vivid memory is that they walked out, left the room, but they went towards a door which was not open. And so they were, I said to them at the time that this doesn't look quite dignified. If you're going to make a demonstration, cover your escape route first. But actually it was a good sign of where we were. It was a frustration that the workers and the employers had on that they got that the governments could not agree on issues which were trade policies and labor rights issues. The employers and the workers could agree on the labor issues, but the whole framework, the link between the ILO and the WTO, which is the World Trade Organization, which is not an issue today. That was one of the most dramatic things in the negotiations. I would also say that those negotiations were the biggest concentration of ambassadors to the World Trade Organization that I have ever seen in an ILO meeting.
Right. And now really kind of these fundamental principles and rights of work, they're really kind of enshrined in the ILO. It's such a key kind of part of what we do, actually. But what about the position in these four areas? You just mentioned child labour and the fact that the numbers have gone down. But there's still some parts of it, for example, with the younger children in child labour, which is still a key issue here. Isn't that correct, Beate?
Yes, indeed, Rosalind. First of all, we all keep saying that core labor standards is the DNA of our organization, and I think it's quite true. There cannot be decent work without respect for fundamental principles and rights at work. So, and as Kari said, since 1998, we have seen incredible progress in terms of attitudes, in terms of acknowledging the problem, taking action, and child labor is indeed a very good example. Now, what we've seen in recent years, and that's indeed actually a rather worrying trend, despite the decline, the overall decline in child labor, we see a stagnation, in particular in the youngest age group, 5 to 11 years old. Those really young children who seem to be from the most vulnerable communities where our interventions maybe haven't really had the impact yet we wanted them to have. So we have to focus on this age group. We also have to focus on countries where the demographics are such that you have a growing population, in particular many young people, often unemployed, who will then be tempted to go into jobs that are hazardous and not really fit for their age. So we have to watch these two trends, but at the same time, and I think that's the encouraging news, we have sound knowledge on what works, proven and tested interventions coming from many countries now, social protection, access to basic education, focusing on the business environment to make sure that enterprises can really employ adults rather than children, make them sustainable, law enforcement, monitoring of specific at-risk industries. I think it's really encouraging to see that these interventions work and have a positive impact.
Right. And what about forced labour? And I know that in the last 20 years, perhaps more, kind of new forms of forced labour have emerged. We use the term often modern slavery, and in fact the ILO has launched the 50 for Freedom campaign against modern slavery in order to kind of promote a new protocol on forced labour. Can you give us the position there on forced labour? Are we actually making any inroads there?
Yes, so first of all, as you said, modern slavery has become a bit of a catch-all, sort of an umbrella term. We focus in the ILO, of course, specifically on forced labor, but what the protocol did, adopted in 2014, it highlighted the trafficking dimensions, the forms of forced labor that are particularly connected with the global economy, increased labor mobility within countries and between countries, and it put more emphasis on prevention and remedies. I think it was, the provisions that you find in this protocol are really, again, globally speaking, were a major breakthrough in terms of strengthening international law on this issue. And indeed, we hope that we will have more countries ratifying the protocol. Just today we got Thailand, as I heard, right. So that's very encouraging.
And this is the first country in Asia to ratify.
Absolutely.
That's
correct. So we really hope that this sets in motion a positive trend. So growing recognition as well on forced labor that this problem should be tackled, both in terms of the more sort of persistent forms of bonded labor or chattel slavery, as well as the modern forms related to trafficking. We have also a growing understanding of what works, better collaboration between different authorities, ministries of interior, ministries of labor, inspection, as well as police and so on. The effectiveness of mobile inspection teams that can go into the risk areas like in agriculture, in sweatshop factories and so on. So yes, definitely many positive examples and also growing political will, encouraging the very, very encouraging, actually. It's, again, Carrie knows from the history how sensitive it was. Only 10 years ago still, it was very difficult to talk about forced labor. Now, if you go into a country, it's okay to talk about it because everyone acknowledges it's widespread. Everyone still faces it. So.
Yes. Is that something touched on your book, Carrie, the forced labor and changing attitudes?
Yes, I'm trying to explain. Because, you see, there is always a moment with this kind of programs that we have. It's either child labor or forced labor. It's the delicate moment when you, in a way, ask a political leader to either explicitly or implicitly accept that they have a problem, that they have forced labor, that they have child labor. And that is the moment when politicians often go into denial, governments go into denial, and then they're also afraid that, if we admit this, so we will have negative consequences. What we are trying to show is that the problem, that you can admit a problem in a way where you look at how to solve it, instead of just going around in circles about how awful the problem is. Everybody has awful problems, but the question is to look, not to concentrate on discussing what is wrong, but to concentrate on discussing how do we make sure that we can get it right. And when at that moment in a country it becomes acceptable to talk about a problem, internally acceptable, and also others outside the country don't criticize the country for trying to do something about it. That is also important, because after all, when the IPEC program started in the early 90s, many of the countries that started working with the ILO openly,
this is the
they
international
were
program for the elimination
worried.
of child labour.
Yes,
Yeah.
the child labour elimination program. At that time, many countries were afraid that by admitting to the problem, they would be subject to sanctions, economic sanctions. And there was a strong push in many industrialized countries to prohibit all imports made by children or so, without anybody really having verification mechanisms of what the situation was. These countries realized that they could actually use the ILO programs as an argument that, look, we're doing something about it. We're trying to do something about it. Help us to do something about it.
And just a reminder for those who've just joined us, this is a live broadcast from the 107th International Labour Conference, and today we're talking about the Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. Now, one of those areas that we're looking at is forced labour, and in fact we have a question now from Vong who asks, what are the differences between forced labour and victims of human trafficking? Perhaps I'll put that to you, Beata.
It's Beata.
Well, thank you very much. And this is a very important question which we get again and again, because indeed the concept of forced labor and human trafficking, they were defined in two different international legal instruments: trafficking in the Palermo Protocol, supplementing the UN Convention Against Transnational Crime, forced labor in the Forced Labor Convention of the ILO in 1929. Now, to put it very sort of without going into a legal debate here, essentially what you can say is that there are forms of forced labor that are not really connected with human trafficking. We, for instance, consider certain forms of prison labor to be a form of forced labor. Under certain conditions, it would amount to forced labor. That's not really covered by the Trafficking Protocol. Similarly, when you look at state-imposed forced labor, in link to the military or other, detention centers or forced labor for the purpose of economic development, which we still see in some countries, it comes out more of the forced labor definition rather than the trafficking. Now, the trafficking definition at the same time is also very broad. It includes forced labor. Forced labor is one of the purposes, sexual exploitation, the exploitation of the prostitution of others, slavery-like practices, but also trafficking for the purpose of organ removal, which we don't cover at the same time under forced labor. So you see there's quite a great amount of overlap between those definitions, but there are also differences between those. But in short, I think what we now see with the growing movement and political commitment is that states have reinforced their legislation on both, on human trafficking and forced labor, because they see that they reinforce each other. And if you have strong laws on trafficking as well as forced labor, you get more prosecutions. That's clear evidence for that. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Beata. And just a reminder, well, first of all, thank you, Vong, for your question. Just a reminder to send us some more questions, because these are really interesting areas. And in fact, one of the areas, or one of the categories in the Fundamental Principles and Rights Declaration is discrimination, and that's a topic that really is a kind of a current topic today. And we've heard a lot, this in this last year or so of gender discrimination, but we also have other forms of discrimination as well, perhaps, for example, those who are living with HIV and AIDS. So again, in this last 20 years, have things really improved if we're still talking about these same issues today?
I would say that things, sometimes improvement comes through that you understand the situation better and you can see it better. And with discrimination, we can see better what kind of problems are due to what kind of discrimination. But discrimination is also a multiple issue. Traditionally we have always started talking about gender and pay discrimination. And of course this is already one of the basic conventions is on pay equity. But then when you come into the whole area, you see that these multiply and they have multiple effects. Actually, the discrimination convention itself is open-ended in that countries can decide that something is discrimination and should be worked against, even if it is not specifically mentioned in the convention. HIV/AIDS is a good example of that. I think the question is that we are starting to be in a situation where institutionally and legally speaking, we are moving, and we have been moving. Whether we are moving sufficiently in terms of perceptions, and particularly perceptions at economically difficult times, in connection with migration or either economic migrants or refugees or others, when there's a perception that you get advantage from remaining in a way in one group and not being part of another group. That is something where there's a huge amount of solidarity work that needs to be done.
Thank you, Carrie. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, but perhaps just adding on what Carrie said, I mean, what we've seen is a very positive trend in extending legislation against discrimination on various grounds. So, especially when you look at recent laws being adopted, they cover sexual orientation, they cover disability, HIV/AIDS status. I mean, you know, considerations that I'm sure the drafters of the convention way back may not have had sort of at the center of their minds at the time. So that's positive. You know, growing recognition, growing awareness. On the gender pay gap, just one quick word. I mean, we've become much better at measuring it. We say that it is about 23%, globally speaking, with great variations across regions and sectors. But of course, there also what we see now is growing interest on part of the private sector to actually tackle the issue. And the media, by the way, plays an important role. I mean, the publication of companies that have a particularly big pay gap plays into this growing awareness. Of course, you've probably seen this also. And we've just launched the Equal International Pay Coalition, EPIC, which brings together governments, businesses, workers' organizations, and the OECD. You and women are part of it. And that's an encouraging global partnership to address this very persistent issue of the gender pay gap.
Great. Now, we've got another question here, but I'm going to ask that in a moment, because this question is about forced labour and child labour. But I just want to ask a question just about the fourth area, the fourth category, which is freedom of association, which we haven't touched on yet, which is kind of quite different to the other three, really. So the question is, I mean, what's the situation today on freedom of association? Is it still something that's still a kind of a core issue for us?
Well, it's a core issue, and it has two sides. There's the question of the freedom to associate, to set up unions or employers' organizations, for that matter, and then the freedom to bargain collectively. And I'm sometimes really asking myself, why in this world where everybody now recognizes the prominence of the market economy, why do people have such a lot of hesitation on the right to collective bargaining and freedom of association? Because they are the most market compatible of these fundamental rights. Actually, they are aimed at making sure that the workers have their rightful share, that the employers can retain their rightful share, that the economy benefits. You know, the whole question of freedom of association goes right back to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. You have an employer who is a union unto himself. So the workers have to have the right to combine and come together to balance that. And the balancing takes place through negotiations. This is I would say this is a very fundamental free market theory. Sometimes just people still think that, unions are troublesome and employers may figure out that they can better decide for themselves, they know better, instead of sitting in long negotiations. But if you look at the sustainable solutions that we have had in the world economic history, there has always been a degree of consensus, negotiation, and so on. The most, just to take two examples from industrialized countries, the New Deal in the US at the time, but the whole European reconstruction program after the Second World War. These have been built on the fact that workers and employers are free to organize and then cooperate with others in the society for common aims.
Okay, now we've got kind of a flurry of questions now, and we've got one on the gender pay gap, which I guess is linked to the discrimination area. And the question from Justin is, what's the biggest obstacle to closing the gender pay gap? And I know actually later this week we will be having another Facebook Live on the gender pay gap, but maybe I'll put that to you, Beate.
Well, that's great publicity for your sessions, but so I will be very brief here. But I think to some extent it's indeed awareness, especially in the private sector. I mean, when you see some of the managers and companies, they often don't understand the concept. It's also a technical matter of how you actually define equal equal pay for work of equal value. It's not that easy, and I think there's a need for awareness raising, capacity building, but also empowering women as well as men to negotiate effectively. And it's very much linked actually to freedom of association and collective bargaining, I would say, and to specific sectors and industries, how they are valued. How do we value care work? I'm just leaving this as a question, but I think you will have a good discussion later on this.
Yes, we will. We will in a couple of days' time. And we've got another question here from India, actually, from Dia. And she says, countries like India often find it problematic to accept forced marriage and interlink it to the concept of labour. In such a scenario, how do you spotlight the issue and get the buy-in of the government to act on it and consequently ratify the protocol? Bit complicated, but I'm sure you'll be able to answer that one.
Difficult question, and probably really one of those areas where we still see some hesitation and sensitivities. And to shed light on it, we actually did measure forced marriage last year for the very first time. It's not an issue that is core to the forced labor definition, but it does intersect with it, as the person just asked. Because in many instances of forced marriage, what we've seen through the research is that it actually does amount to a situation of forced service or servitude, essentially. And if there's no consent, then the issue becomes, could become something of forced labor. So the very conservative estimate is that 15 million, mostly women and girls, are affected by forced marriage, and I think we need to do more to shed light on it and facilitate a discussion. It's certainly not something that you can just resolve by decree. It needs a change of attitude, which we've discussed earlier. Right.
Okay. Now we only have just a few more minutes. So I think that one of the key questions I'd like to know, and probably our viewers as well, is that if you can measure it, how successful would you say that the declaration has been?
Well, if you want to measure success, our traditional measurement, of course, is ratification of conventions. And we have come to a over 90% rate of ratification of these 8 fundamental conventions. Freedom of association lagging a little bit behind for many reasons, but still, that's quite, unique, and that was something that was unforeseeable. We did not expect such an increase in ratifications, so it made a difference. The other thing is the difference has taken place in terms of, let's say, official principles. I don't think that there is any government at this moment, or any employer or any trade union, which could openly say that, look, we don't accept this, or we don't, this doesn't concern us, or so on. So at a certain level, there is a consensus. This consensus on core labor standards, on fundamental workers' rights, did not exist before 1998. It started built up in the mid-90s, but this was what was then written down in the declaration. So, to me, this is the biggest change, and of course, the simple fact that we have found out ways in which to deal with the problems on the ground, where it really matters. This is not something which is just for conference halls or even just for standard setting.
Yes.
It is a question of application in the realities in each of the countries.
Right, okay. And I'm just going to ask you a final question. Maybe you both want to kind of answer it as well.
I just want to say something
you want to add to that?
success
Okay.
story. I mean,
Okay.
I feel tempted at least. I think one other criteria is really the way the declaration has made its way into other instruments and declarations. I mean, you will find hundreds of, if not thousands, of codes of conducts, of trade agreements, of high-level political declarations, the UN Global Compact, OECD, all referring to those core labor standards. I think that was remarkable, the uptake outside the ILO in our usual constituency. And then the other thing, as Kari said, the degree by which we see countries taking it on themselves, you know, not with the ILO, but actually themselves. So I think that for me is a great achievement.
Okay, so my final question, though, for both of you, but maybe we can try and keep it a little short, although maybe that's a bit unfair given the question, which is what do you see are the key challenges that lie ahead in terms of achieving the objectives of the declaration?
Well, first, I start with ratification, and hopefully we will see more ratification on the freedom of association collective bargaining conventions, which are much lower than the others. We want to see the forced labor protocol widely ratified, very important. But the other side then also is looking at implementation. How can we have a greater integration of those rights on the ground? Because when you look at the Sustainable Development Agenda and the integration also of different policy challenges, I think we have to get better in understanding why certain communities are persistently excluded, and where you see a violation of all the rights persistently, and that will be a major challenge.
Yeah. And for you, Kari, a major challenge?
I think the major challenge, if I would have to pick out one, I would say, how can we develop our argument further so that people credibly understand that respecting fundamental rights at work actually makes economic sense. Not only social sense, not only political sense, it makes economic sense. It is a way of making a decent market economy function.
Right.
It's another book to write.
I think so. In the meantime, I must thank you for taking part in this Facebook Live, and thank you, audience. Thank you, Kari Tapiola, and thank you, Beata Andrews. And for the audience, we have another Facebook Live tomorrow. Tomorrow is actually World Environment Day, and we have Facebook Lives in 3 different languages, really looking at the impact of climate change on jobs. So I do hope you'll be able to join us, and thank you for watching this one. Thank you.
Thank you.